All right. Good morning, Layman.
Hey, Brent.
How you doing?
Tremendously well. Probably the best anyone has ever done.
Perfect. Today we're going to talk about consensus building. A very scary concept for some people.
Yeah, well, it's a very easy concept to praise, but actually figuring out how to do it is something that provokes a lot of reluctance in people. And maybe even there's an intentional element in that reluctance where they don't actually want to either undergo the emotions you have to go through in order to share enough to get consensus, or maybe they're worried about what starts happening when you actually do have consensus and things start to move.
Yeah. And typically people are attracted to workshops and processes, things where they can learn and grow. And that's exactly what this is. But they're turned off by the idea of, being told what to do, or um, having their minds changed, or thinking they're going to be pressured into some kind of groupthink. So there's many aspects to this process. There's the basic kind of facilitation framework, the 8 breaths of process architecture. I think that's a really good kind of skeleton to hang a lot of this work on. And then there's all the research I did from separate articles that kind of give insight into the process of consensus building. What works, what doesn't, what are the incentives, and what are the turnoffs. And there's a lot there. And I guess there's one thing to kind of foreground what this is about is, partly it's connected to the critiques that I've made, but we can also think of it independently, right? And so I anticipate many different threads of this, coming out before they come back together and be weaved together and threaded together. Because the consensus building project is about taking those different threads, but it sort of has to begin with divergence. Like in the 8 breaths of process architecture, it begins with that divergence, generally speaking. And so because I'm in multiple communities, we all are to some extent, each, there can be a different consensus building process in different communities and on a one-to-one basis, right? So we can explore the potential today just for that one-on-one convergence. And then, there was a term that I really liked from one of the papers. It was, one second here, Persuasion Cascades, right? And so that's like my concept of ripple effects, but it's more precise, and it's more context relevant here. So, and I've talked about this before with people, like, if we're all looking for sort of tipping points to change, and I can change one person, like I can change you on a particular issue, and then you become convinced. And again, it's not like a peer pressure thing, but it's like you actually change on your own and you believe it. So it's an authentic metanoia. And then you want to go and change the next person who is connected in the chain of us, but that I couldn't possibly convince that person, right? So it has to go through the chain. And so the persuasion cascades leverage support up the chain of command and horizontally across networks, is how I put it. So we can
The pandemic of understanding.
Sounds good. I've got the cure for ignorance.
We've been talking about trying to get some kind of convergence and consensus building projects underway, because obviously a lot of people are responding to the world situation. A lot of people have a lot of different views, but there's also a lot of commonality. There's also a lot of movement trying to take place in the world. So everybody kind of, I think, senses this has to happen. I talked to a guy named Ara the other day. He had the same kind of view on his thing. He's got to get some kind of consensus convergence going on. So there's got to be convening and getting the people, figuring out how to get them together. But once you've got them in a Zoom chat or whatever the format is, what's the process? Now, you posted this I think, really insightful and comprehensive article the other day, which takes you through the 8 breaths process, but also runs through a number of other processes or steps. So what's your overall take on that? Like, if we were doing it now, if this was one of the units of the process, what would we do? Where would we start?
Yeah, let me give 2 answers. One is that, we're gonna have a conversation and kind of, ratchet up our understanding. So a dialectic as well. But in the general context, these various sense-making communities that like conversation and like build, they're implicitly building a sort of mutual understanding, right? So they might not like the consensus idea because it's still too concrete, and they wanna wade in these uncertain times and waters. But what I'm saying is they've already been building up towards this type of moment. And and the research suggests that, consensus building works well in uncertainty to some extent. And it's, you know that should be part of the incentive, is like, oh, we're so uncertain, maybe we can build some consensus. And I want to try to, demonstrate it with very simple examples, obviously. Like part of it is, to practice it in a meta sense with building consensus around the concept of building consensus. And also the idea of convergence, right? So I've written a lot about convergence. So now let's prime and brief people and run a workshop on convergence and see what kind of mutual understanding can emerge and then converge. So, to demonstrate by example, we can talk about some things that there's already a pretty strong consensus of. And then where there's not a consensus, we can expand on why there's some doubt or skepticism or ignorance around that subject, right? And so I touched on this in my conversation with Vinay yesterday, like climate change, for example, right? There is a consensus on climate change. And it's actually close to 100% among climate scientists, but that the 97% figure gets thrown out because the 3% comes from a sample of non-climate scientists, right? So it actually skews the picture, but it's still a pretty strong consensus. And then, just to, part of the consensus process is bonding, right? You want the group to establish some trust and some solidarity, but even before the process begins and throughout the process. So by way of example, though, we can use something like climate change, hopefully get a consensus of 100 people in a 100 people room. But we could also talk about other established things like the heliocentric universe, right? Like before this, there was no consensus, so to speak. And then there was, but it took a lot of pressure and the tipping point, a lot of blood was shed. But then, even though that's true, and that orbits are more elliptical than circular, like there's finer sort of levels of truth. There's something more true than the heliocentric model, which is that our solar system also revolves around a galaxy. So we can expand the frame and have another kind of consensus on a different scale, that is kind of related. So that's sort of my introduction, and I hope we can kind of keep going back and forth, because everybody that I will invite into this process will have some knowledge or skill, about how to change people's minds, or how consensus works, or how to facilitate a group, or they'll have some expertise on a particular subject. Could be politics, could be sociology, could be history. Could be something like conspiracy, something more controversial. So we want to, there's good reasons to want to try to build consensus, because each of us could be carrying around some dogma, some ideology that just on the face of it we're incentivized to shed?
I think it's, the value in consensus is building a common spirit that has the capacity to mobilize people in social and political circumstances. But, just in terms of building consensus on consensus, my traditional concern about consensus is the risk of favoring the intersubjective mutual experience over the buildup of collective intelligence in systems, which might require a greater degree of independence of mind, right? So there have been some studies where you get 100 experts together, and after the conference, they agree more, but their collective guess is actually dumber because each one of them has given away some of their understanding.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
now you might call that the difference between consensus and groupthink or something like that, but I think a lot of people might instinctively feel that their independence of mind and their feelings on the subject has to be preserved from some kinds of consensus in order that the group is as smart as it can be.
Yeah, that sounds good. And that's a good, already we're off to a good start in terms of, examples of different insights people bring to the table. And then, just so I don't forget, we would be having facilitators that help kind of reiterate that information and record it, you know, so this may be something that has to be explored more and crystallized, that relationship between not necessarily between groupthink and consensus building if we're already over the groupthink part, but just in terms of how you put it, the kind of a dilution or a salience kind of issue. And then, how that leads to collective action. So building consensus around politics, for example, is really important for me because politics is very politicized and mystified, right? And it's something that, regardless of people's background and education, they want to stick to their convictions or beliefs, and they want to stay loyal to the individual that they think embodies that, right? For them. So people who like Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or whoever that like kind of presents well, but might not necessarily have the actual policy grit and clout to back it up. We want to try to transcend those errors and sense making we make around politics because they're so prolific and extant. So and again, it's not groupthink, right? It's like it's about demystifying. So one of the things I've always said about politics, particularly the politics of the past 5 years with Bernie Sanders, is that it's not about the horse race. Bernie Sanders is not a horse race candidate. He might be painted that way in the media, but fundamentally it's always been about the movement, of which Bernie is sort of coincidentally the chosen leader, right? So because he's been a lifelong progressive, kind of on the cutting edge, but never really recognized as such on a national level until 2015, 2016. And then you have this enormous resistance. So we want to build consensus around how to get things done. And that's been one of the hangups of Emerge, that they want to be apolitical. They don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to fight over politics. And it's been my sort of contention that this has been the easy way out. It avoids these hard questions and hard processes. So before we go too deeper down that road, let me just bring it back to say that this process works better the more you commit to it, right? You get in what you put up. It requires investment of, as I say, resources, commitment, and will. And so, everybody's short on time. I seem to have more time than the average person, but everyone is very busy with different projects, different commitments, different agendas. And part of this, the incentive of the consensus building process is to shake that up a bit and to say, you know, like maybe everything you're doing is not right. It's not conducive to the kind of convergence we need and that we ultimately want. So, um, ideally, this process just pays dividends, right? It doesn't detract from people's work. It helps them refocus it.
There's I think a real issue around superficiality and depth in consensus. You know, and you were drawing a parallel a little bit to the political process. And I know when you deal with people who were very strongly in the Bernie side and very skeptical of, say, a Pete Buttigieg, their argument usually revolves around he's being relatively superficial, even though he's saying a lot of the right things. And this other guy is able to catalyze a movement because of his relative moral consistency over time. So there's this one level where a lot of parts of your structure line up and can move things and galvanize energy. And this other level where it never really gets off the ground, no matter how good it sounds. And I think there's an issue around consensus building that's like that, because it's pretty easy to get a bunch of people to say yes to consensus in principle, or to get them to be congenial with each other, right, and have a nice undisturbed mood where they generally feel like something happened, and this kind of stuff, where there's a surface level of sense making. But what do you need to do in order to get to a deeper level of sense making? There is like will and those things, and there's an element of risk in it, I think, which is very often the one that puts people off. You have to, but you need a lot of trust in order to go through risk, right? So if I'm going to bring up something that's divisive, or I think separates us or exposes me, that may be exactly what I need to do in order to get to my next level of participation in that process. But I can only do it if I learn bit by bit that a given person or a given space is safe for me to do that in.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think this is a very safe space. And, you know, going back to what I said about how this dovetails with a lot of things people are already doing, right? Like the Stoa, for example. And now I've given a Stoa talk, and it was, you know, very critical and kind of unconventional for that brand, but it dovetails. What I'm proposing now dovetails. I mean, first of all, you need that kind of meta critique, but then second of all, you know, there's related things like, you know, so I have in this article, because the word is in the 8 breaths of process architecture dojo, right? And Kira in the Stoa is doing emotional dojos, you know, and I've had conversations with her, and she's an interesting person, and particularly, you know, what she not only highlights in herself, but tries to bring forth for everybody else is the emotional blocks, right? So what happens when contentious topics like racism pop up, right? And you have a physical reaction, right? You need to have some skills to cope with that. So, you know, within this kind of consensus building project, there will be moments that people have to break out into these other groups, right? And this can be an ongoing thing. Like it's not a linear temporal process, you know, because it's online and because it's, you know, distributed. It's going to be happening in many places and many times. But ideally, we would hold the space consistently for you know, several of these processes to play out over a fixed period of time, right? Like say there's 8 steps, so like say once a week for 8 weeks, right? And so you'd have cohorts, and each cohort would go through this process. But the other thing I want to add is along those lines is that you know, people will may be threatened by certain things and maybe want to drop out at certain points, and you know, I suppose that's fine. At the end of it all, they don't have to be absolutely convinced, but I think they're going to miss out on the kind of joy, if you will, of consensus, right? Because it's work. We're really trying to build up something that we believe in and that we trust, and that is really an exceptional quality of truth, and perhaps, you know, that we couldn't have created on our own. And that's kind of the point. There's, we're into metamodernism, but I don't see metamodernism in the hyper pluralism of emerge, where there's many things going on there. There's already kind of power differentials and status games where, everyone sort of wants an equal say, but not everyone has an equal platform. So this process is really important to flesh out the different pathologies and the different strengths of a actual collective intelligence. And, this is why I think it's just so fitting too, that the emergence part of it is called the groan zone. And the groan zone, as I describe on the graphic, is bookended. It's preceded by a fear of letting go, and then it's followed by a fear of acting. Right, so people have to let go at first, and then we'll build up that consensus, and then it leads towards action, and action is inhibited by fear. And that I think is, again, what has been holding people back, right? So yeah, we need to build that consensus process.
I think if people go through it and it works in the sense of giving them more energy, then they're much more likely to go to the next one and run the whole 8, and also have the mobilization energy to do these spin-off ones that might occur along the way. So it's got to be set up in such a way that it actually works for people. And that means you got to hit a kind of sweet spot in terms of numbers. Like, not just like 8 is a pretty good number. It requires a bit of a commitment, but also it's not indefinite, 16 maybe is too much. And the same with participants, right? If you're going to go through it, I mean, how long can a person reasonably be expected to sit on a Zoom call, right? And that limits the number of participants. If everybody's going to engage over a period of 2 or 3 hours or whatever it is, how many people can go through that process successfully in that amount of time? What's too many? What's too few? I mean, once you get above 10 or 12 people on a Zoom call, you can't even really track their faces.
Yeah. And also, along those lines, and as I was saying before, so I have in my mind kind of some ideal cohorts, like people I would love to bring together, many of whom definitely disagree, right? People I conflict with. And so I'd love to bring that together, but part of that is also unrealistic, partly because of logistics and partly because of the distance of those people.
Who's in your fantasy cohort?
Yeah, I'll rattle off some people, but let me say first, like, what's going to end up, what we're going to have to go with is just who's available. Right, and that's fine too, right? Because the first few cohorts can be sort of experimental in that sense. You don't know what you're going to get. And, so for example, in my Stoa talk, it was mostly supporters of mine, mostly allies, right? And that's fine. It was good. I was hoping for a little of, my critics. Well, I don't have any critics, actually. I have haters. I just need to make that important distinction. So who would be in my ideal one? I'll just lay it out, Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger. I would say definitely not anybody from the IDW yet. That's a bridge too far, but yeah, Jonathan Rowson, Bonita Roy, David Fuller. See, who else do I vehemently disagree with and clash with? I mean, so those are people I disagree with. I would want people that are allies too. Yourself. I don't want to speak for which side he's on, but Zach Stein. I think he's going to be on all sides. And let's say, the people I spoke with in the past 2 days: Vinay Gupta, Michelle Bowens, and of course I want to include Michael Brooks, someone like him there, because he's in a different world. And I think he implicitly builds consensus in his project. And that's something I would like to formalize and bring in and, have these worlds overlap. So, we're getting up to 8 people there, right? So that's a good kind of, power who's who that would be very difficult, but very constructive to try to build a consensus around.
Yeah, that's great because
Let's say,
obviously you're not going to get those people. Certainly not at
well,
first.
exactly. Yeah,
I think it gives the people who might want to be involved a sense of where you're thinking and feeling on that subject.
yeah,
And if they also see that those people are interesting, or that they can tune into you a little bit better through who you think is interesting and through your sense of how to have people who conflict and don't conflict together.
yeah.
I think that gives them a better sense of what they would be involved in if they said yes.
Yeah, and I completely agree. That's not going to happen off the bat. I know the difference between idealizing and reality somewhat. However, what's interesting and what is inviting about it is that some of those people I've never even talked to, right? And so there's misunderstandings created by the lack of communication, right? There's miscommunication over text, and there's a lot of willful ignorance. Just that person threatens me, or I don't like their behavior, so I'm gonna block them out of my mind. That is very not just anti-consensus, but anti-intellectual, and it's putting the the moral or whatever embodied kind of reaction to the situation. It's putting that above the epistemics, the truth seeking, and it shouldn't be that way. It should be the other way. We should be able to push through those membranes of pain to get into this consensus building project. And another thing that I would say that deters people, and this wasn't a part of the article, but it just occurred to me, is the overconfidence that a lot of people have. So they'll go and they'll wax on uncertainty, but they'll have an overconfidence on their own position about that uncertainty, right? And this is particularly salient with Jim Rutt, for example, right? Who I'm slowly, rebuilding a relationship with. But it's salient for him because, he has a strong conviction about the uncertainty and sort of agnosticism. But he's somewhat authoritarian about that, and at the same time, he's clutching some of his own dogmas that completely contradict that principle. So he's someone at the other end of the pole from me. However, we both recognize that there's a fruitful potential in short circuiting that gap, right? And it can send a message to other people. So that's what we're working on, and we're building up to that. So it's kind of idealized, confrontation, but structured by both of us to some extent. Exploring this convergence process and consensus building process just between the two of us.
It seems like two people have an opportunity to organically go through that process as long as they share the intention and the courage to undergo it.
Yeah.
When it comes to having 8 people together for a couple of hours, it's got to be a lot more structured than that.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, how does that really work? What if, we sat down with 6 other people?
Yeah.
What did those couple hours look like?
Yeah. Well, yeah, let me agree with you. Because I think there'll be, fruits to just me and Jim hashing it out. However, I still believe that the ideal scenario is there would be a mediator, and both of us would trust that mediator, right? And they'd be a kind of live fact checker too. So when there's some sort of dispute, it can be settled by that third party. In terms of if we have, say, a group of 8 people for like 4 hours, which would be amazing. If we're following the 8 breaths, right, it would start with a call, and I would be the primary caller in this scenario. somebody else is welcome to do their own process. I can't stop them. However, I would warn against it because, as I said, like, people are skeptical of this process, right? And the people who might want to rush to it and do it on their own might have a perverse incentive or might want to weaponize it, right? Or just, maybe they just have an ego and they want to be on top, right? So maybe they're not qualified to do it, but they want to do it anyways. So
And
in
what
this
is
case,
that call? That's just like an opening statement of what we're going to try to work on for this 4 hours.
yeah, the call is so in the image, it's preceded by a disturbance possibility question. Like there is a disturbance in the force, and the call led by a caller is a person quoting a person who deeply holds a question, a problem, a challenge. Right. So I think I'm deeply holding all of those things. The question is, can we build consensus? The problem is, here's where we all disagree on false premise, with false premises, and it leads to conflict. It leads to inaction. It multiplies our uncertainty. Right. So that's the problem. And then the challenge is, here's the plan to deal with it. Here's the invitation. And so it's a call to action on one hand, and it's also a call of, here's the thesis. And then it's also an invitation to other callers. Right. So I said that I would lead it, but I would not lead it alone. So I would find other callers who, so we would build a kind of proto consensus and bring in different people to fill different roles. So that kind of precedes the process. And, so we could go through this process in order to develop the wider plan to go through that process, right? It's got to be recursive in this sense, so, in theory, we could try to work all the way through it now, but I think it is a group thing. You need more people, and it requires, stewards and sense makers and all these different things, right? So that's why I point to the process. I think in conversation here, we're just doing a different thing. We can, we can have that conversational interplay. We can discuss the different concepts. But so the process starts with the call, and then it's followed up by the second breath to clarify, right? And to clarify is defining purpose and fostering engagement. And invites callers and hosts to collectively articulate the principles, group needs, and desired outcomes. And we've already discussed a bit of that. I've tried to just foreground that in different ways. And then once clarity is found, we can move to the next step. The third breath is the behind the scenes prep, where we design the form and the structure of the process and decide on the art of inviting people. And so because I've already talked to some other people about this, like Alistair Langer and Sana Rodelius, I feel like with them that we're at the third step. But not really, because we haven't had a group call yet. I've just had individual calls with them. So yeah, so there's that, because I have not mastered the art of inviting people, right? And I don't have the platform. I don't have the reach. So it's going to take those ripple effects and the cascading persuasion to invite more and more people, right? And then within this breath, a venue is chosen, right? Like Zoom, and then, hopefully a future physical location, because this is what I proposed fundamentally that the third Emerge conference should be about, right? So if we have a third Emerge conference this year, and I've already said to Thomas, and he agreed somewhat, that it should be about convergence. And now we've got kind of the scaffolding for that, right? So again, it would look very different over a series of weekend workshops. But the initial conditions are super important, right? And that's why this is a critical step, to do it online and for me to initiate it, because nobody else is going to is initiating this, right? Like, not, not trying to brag or anything, but nobody else is proposing anything like this.
So in
They're
your,
proposing
when you
similar things.
envision this,
Mhm,
let's say you had the right 8 people for 4
mhm.
hours. When they show up, is that when you start going step 1, step 2, step 3, or are they showing up at that event and we're presuming we're at step 4 or 5 already? Because they're showing up with a context in mind. There's already
Yeah,
a venue, right? Do
yeah.
we come into that at 5, or do we have to start at 1?
Well, having never actually been through this process yet myself, that's a good question, and I think it's a bit of both. I think we can try to work through the whole process in one long session. Um, um, but it's also a process in which, like, we'd want to, define a cohort, and then work through each step at different, uh, like, works through each step on each call. Um,
Another part of
but
that is,
it would begin by a kind of, just in the loose frame of divergence, emergence, convergence. There would be a lot of, like, say, I would brief the group, and it could be just like sort of reading through this article, or it could be more specific for that session. But at each step, it would also invite people to give feedback, right? Um,
how do you manage that part, right? Because I've been
mhm,
in a lot of group
mhm,
chats,
mhm.
and unless you are very clear and there's somebody saying, now you answer, now you answer, now you
Right,
answer, then a lot of time is lost with
right.
people wondering whose turn it is. And the people who want to be less aggressive and more thoughtful often hang back, and a few people jump in quickly and talk a lot.
Yeah.
So whoever is facilitating, or whatever the name of that role is, has to be very on the ball about making sure each person gets asked and has their time.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at a list here. It's from the Innes article. She lays out 8 preconditions for successful consensus building, right? And so this is eight steps as well, but it doesn't necessarily parallel the 8 steps of the process architecture. So number 1, inclusion of all stakeholders. Number 2, a meaningful task with a timely impact. Um, so again, the caller, who's me, would explain all that, would foreground that. This is the meaningful task, to build consensus around climate change. This is the timely impact. We have 2 months, and then we need to, get our shit together for the election or whatever. And then, there needs to be a long-term strategy deployed. And part of it too, just to tangent from these preconditions for a second, is, this isn't just a free-for-all where people come and share their opinions. It's really important to do this, like, priming and briefing that I speak of, where we share resources, right? And we, at least at the outset, it's decided, like, by the caller, by the group, by the hosts, that these are the best resources, that it's like, the curriculum has been curated. We're going to kind of go through this as a crash course. This knowledge is hard to parse. It's not something you want to inherently disagree with as a knee-jerk reaction, right? So, I mean, let's just say we're trying to build a consensus around one particular book. I think that's an interesting idea, because before you try to build a consensus, you have to have the kind of coursework, right? Everyone has to read the book, as like in a book club kind of way. They have to discuss it in a free and open way. There has to be some people with expertise, and um, I think the fundamental kind of principle that makes it work is that, you know we're committing to the process, right? So that there's a certain sort of faith that the truth will emerge. But coming back to the consensus idea, we're trying to build not just intersubjectivity, but say interobjectivity, something that's actionable. So, I like that idea too, building consensus around a particular difficult a thesis. But we're also trying to build something bigger than that. So number 3, participants set some rules for behavior, agenda setting, decision making, right? So this is where everyone gets heard and brings in their ideas to self-limit and to influence the course. Number 4, process begins with mutual understanding of interests and anti-bargaining principles, right?
What's an
So,
anti-bargaining principle?
well, it means you're not looking for trade-offs, like, it's a kind of anti-rivalrous principle. Bargaining suggests that a person is doing some negotiating, like you give me this and I'll give you that, because some dogma is going to be really hard to let go, right? And to use the intellectual dark web as an example, that's been a very contentious topic, right? And you know what I've done through my critiques or meta critiques is try to consolidate some sort of a consensus, right? Some sort of a leftist consensus. And, agree or disagree, I think that's kind of what I've done. Because there is more or less a left consensus that is just, it's not that the left got together and coordinated. No, a lot of people are doing it independently, right? So Nathan Robinson has his critique and Michael Brooks has his, and 100 odd YouTubers have theirs, and 100 odd articles have theirs, and they're all very good. But there's a sort of overlapping consensus implicit when you take the meta perspective. And so, it would still be a long way to go, and it would be very interesting to try to build a consensus through that, because I think a lot of these leftist critiques, including my own, can appear one-sided. And I've written positive things about the intellectual dark web and about Peterson. So the consensus building would be to try to actually, leapfrog that sort of chasm of understanding, or uncanny valley, if you will, where everyone has some valid perspective, but we don't have a consensus. So anti-bargaining, that's kind of what I'm getting at there.
How do you, and this applies to, I think, all of it, so I don't mind bringing it in here, but how do you know you've got a consensus?
Well, there's, voting is one way to kind of measure it. And this is critical, because the result you get depends on how you phrase the question, right? And this is sort of a kind of quantum principle, because you're getting what you measure, right? And you're almost not getting anything else. You're only getting what you measure. And then it becomes a kind of paradox, right? Like you don't get a complete answer. So yeah, just a sort of poll or voting is one way, but it's very important how the thesis is phrased, right? But again, let's take something simple like climate change. And I could draw a simple distinction in the first instance, just to demonstrate how people diverge on this issue, right? It's not sufficient to say, is climate change true, right? Because we have to distinguish between natural climate change and anthropogenic climate change, right? And so a lot of conservatives will agree that natural climate change is true, but they don't agree that anthropogenic climate change is true. So that's a one, crystal clear example of what we'd be trying to build consensus about, because it's not enough that we all agree that natural climate change is true, because once you start to disentangle that, you find that, well, they're still advocating different policies. They mean slightly different things about natural climate change, and some people just think it means the weather, and it doesn't mean the weather. What it means is, the natural climate change means is that, just as an ice age ended 10,000 years ago, another one could hit. Like we're in a kind of we're in a kind of ecologically stable period, right? The Holocene, and we know that that's ended effectively, whether we call it the Anthropocene now or something else, right? Capitalocene. So again, these are the basic distinctions we want to build consensus about, and then kind of ratchet up from there.
How would you juggle the need to get consensus on truth versus the need to get consensus on action? Because like I imagine there's a lot of people who you could say to them, if they, let's say they're anthropogenic climate change skeptics, but you could probably get a lot of consensus from them if you said, well, if anthropogenic climate change was true, don't you think we should do these things? And they would say, of course it's not true, but I guess if it was true, I could get on board with that. Now, they've made a move toward consensus there in action, right? If it's not incumbent upon them to share the fact set worldview and affirmed values, they might be able to get behind the action. On the other hand, they might not get behind the action enough if they don't agree about the truth. So, what do you give precedent to in terms of action consensus and truth consensus?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we can answer it sort of by extending this climate change question because like I just said about the ice age, like even if we disagree on anthropogenic climate change, we can start to agree on some kind of resilient strategies and we can anticipate different situations, right? Refugees, and we can start to coordinate action around the inevitable shocks that are going to come, right? And I find it interesting that the Pentagon, for example, actually recognizes officially that climate change is the #1 threat, right? So it's not terrorists, it's not a human force, it's nature, and nature that is a security threat, right? And so you can't fight climate change with guns and bombs, obviously, but you can through logistics, right? And kind of the deployment of humanitarian aid. So this should be the top priority of the military, right? And it can pursue that while drawing down its budget, right? Because this is not a military scenario, so to speak. And to think of it as such is also a bad idea. And that's, this has to be part of the consensus building. Let's agree that the military response should not be to, corral people that are climate refugees, and treat them with hostile force, or, to describe, to draw distinctions between people who are hit by a hurricane as like looters and victims,
So getting on back a little bit to the question of how consensus is established, I concur very much that the specific phrasing of the question makes a huge difference in terms of getting a collective intelligence result out of a group, right? If you just, if you go to the polls and there's just two names and it's just pick one of these two names, that's
right.
very different than if it says, which of these two people do you think is going to make our country safer, or something specific that they can get together on. So there's that aspect for sure, a polarizing preciseness. But what about the actual voting procedure? Because, right, secret ballot is one of those things where we use it because people don't exactly vote their conscience when everyone can see them. And there's an argument against simple majorities, right? We might say, well, are there ranked voting choices here? Should we all, pick a number between 1 and 10 and see what the average is? What's a smart way of voting that accommodates the degree and depth of the consensus we're trying to build?
Yeah, those are good questions, and I don't have answers to it all. This is where I would hope that people bring those solutions to the table rather than bring problems to the table. And also, I throw voting out there as one way to kind of measure and capture the result, but it doesn't have to be reduced to that. So, part of it is, we could go around the circle at the beginning, kind of, and people share what they think, and then we'll do that throughout the process. But then especially at the end, we all go around and try to reflect that new consensus, and the measure of it is not the results of the poll, but the measure of it is internal. It's internalized, and so we all go around and reflect this new higher thesis through our own understanding, and then we all hear each other, and it's a higher quality signal, right? We all want to improve the signal to noise ratio, so we're all going to benefit from that, and then we can all still reflect a different aspect of it, and then we get the chance to hear each other, and then it's like you can decide on your own whether consensus has been reached. But like in that spirit, let me rattle off the last 4 preconditions.
Yeah, go for it.
So 5 is dialogue where all are heard and participate on equal terms, and that's kind of in the middle of that 8 breaths process as well. 6, self-organized process. It's a self-organized process to question the status quo and all assumptions, right? So this, in the first instance, it's a deconstructive practice, and then it becomes a reconstructive practice, right? That's why it's good that it's, divergence, emergence, convergence, so that we don't escape this process in just a kind of postmodern relativist fashion, but that we come back to trying to reconstruct, a new plateau of understanding. Number 7, information is universally shared among participants, right? This goes back to what I was saying about kind of the briefing and the common resources, right? So for each topic, right, I would share like a set of books, like, and articles, and so just for this consensus building process, I would share all the articles that I have invoked here, right? And I read them all to varying degrees, right? And I would share them, and then just by sharing those articles, I'm extending the epistemic validity and the invitation for others to ground their understanding in those common resources, right? So then it's not all placed on my shoulders, but then we have 8 people or 100 people or however who have also looked at the articles, and that they because I can't possibly hold all this knowledge in my head. So I've just written an article, but then there's the resources behind that article, right? So I would want, again, I'd want facilitators and mediators who have professional backgrounds in this kind of thing, and Peter Lindbergh is a good person for that in some sense. Like, I don't expect him to bring the epistemic confidence, right? Because he's already made clear that he's a sort of professional agnostic. So this is where we validate each other's strengths, and again, to build consensus. And then the final point, this is a precondition, right? Understanding consensus as reached only when all interests and concerns have been explored and satisfied. And that sounds good, but it goes back to what you were saying, that, how do we make sure we don't have a suboptimal outcome? Because on paper, any kind of like, town hall debate or, city council kind of process is doing this, right? They're listening to stakeholders and all this kind of thing, but the process gets distorted by lobbyists and whatnot, right? So, again, it comes back to how clear is the initial call and the premises, like, because we want to be post-capitalist, right? For example, like, so this comes back to metamodernism and the meta crisis, right? What do those things mean? And so, again, this is an example of content we can insert into this process because it's never been done, right? And we've all got different ideas about those things, but with metamodernism in particular, well, I've mapped the resources, right? The explicit resources, at least. I've written about it, I've tried to synthesize it myself, and I've invited that is a collective intelligence project. But what we've not done is workshopped it, right? So, you and I and many others have been in a kind of this community for 4 years, kind of trading emails and, debates and this and that, but there hasn't been a lot of face-to-face interaction. There hasn't been a lot of direct engagement or confrontation. There hasn't been a lot of mediation. There hasn't been a lot of classes or coursework, right? It's all been a kind of free-for-all. And so I've been talking about this idea of consensus building over those years, but not having the resources and the timing not being right and not having enough clout and influence myself. And I think at least my intentions there have been validated, because we have gotten into a deeper meta crisis. And we've gotten here because of, if we're to recognize our own role as kind of a microcosm of it, we failed ourselves and each other to build solidarity and to build consensus. And so this is why I say, and the research suggests, like, when there's uncertainty and low trust, and it's just like in actual violent conflicts in the world, there's conflict resolution, negotiating, there's all these processes that have to be invited and brought to the fore. So that's why I say this is the moment for that.
Yeah, there's some kind of move has to go on there. There's obviously been a lot of good work in bringing depth spirituality and depth psychology and some element of depth sociology together, and we've got all these somewhat ephemeral but really existing communities that are trying to apply a meta vision of various kinds. But it seems to translate mostly into people's individual lives in terms of its real practice. And we disagree or agree publicly, but it doesn't become anything. And that requires some other kind of process, some kind of mobilizing convergence. And I think this is an attempt to answer that question. How do all these diversities really come together? Of all the people who say we have to embrace the diversities and then come together, where's the coming together of all those people?
Yeah.
How does it translate into the actual world? Where does it make contact with energies and movements and events that are occurring spontaneously in the civilization? And how do we get on board with that from a meta perspective?
Exactly. And I'm bringing together at least two major processes here. Like, I'm introducing two new things. One is consensus building and the other is convergence, right? And I'm not just using convergence in a collapsed kind of buzzword sense, because I've done the homework and, worked on a book about it and wrote an article about that book, right? About the meta convergence continuum. So again, within this emergence community, nobody has touched that kind of convergence literature. And that's a whole thing to bring in, both as a concept and as a practice, right? I'm trying to introduce the practice here and how it dovetails with consensus building. And I just want to read this quote from Innes, because it's right in front of me and it's relevant to what I was saying before and now. Quote, consensus building is called for where uncertainty is rampant, where no one has enough power to produce results working alone, where stakeholders are engaged in self-defeating and paralyzing conflict. And I would say that is what's happening. Where there are gaps in understanding and in discourse among players, where the solutions to well-recognized problems have not been developed, or where old solutions no longer work. The conditions of a global postmodern world have contributed to the demand for consensus building. And I thought it was interesting, end quote, I thought it was interesting that they used the word postmodern, right? This is in 2016, because again, this just speaks to the awareness and the salience of that postmodern concept reaching its potential, and kind of collapsing under its own weight, if you will, but still being useful. But there's the confusion because of that postmodern world. And I think, we're at least somewhat versed on this metamodern attractor, but the mainstream media, the public discourse, governments, think tanks are still not, and academia, they're not up to speed on the challenge that metamodernism presents and the solutions that it offers. And so we've got the postmodern conditions for consensus building. And I'm proposing this as a metamodern process and praxis. Right. So I thought that was a good quote for me to include as a block quote in that overall article.
Yeah, we're in an interesting world situation where all the institutional power structures are pretty much still the modernist ones. And they are in part responding to postmodern developments over the past several decades. But those developments really haven't come to fruition in a significant way. And they've mostly been taken on as tribal tokenism or as a way for modernists to market people. So we're not exactly sure what postmodern challenges, postmodern ideas even really look like, can look like, should look like. The only way you could tell is by looking back at them, so to speak, from a meta-modern perspective, right? So to me, the meta-modern mind has to be the one who says what postmodern really is or should be. They don't quite know yet, and clearly the modernists and the traditionalists don't know. So from my point of view, that sort of meta-progressive movement is what's needed, and that's got to be able to incorporate a right and left wing of its own. It's got to be able to separate itself from the liberal modern establishment to some degree, which I see as having a right and a left wing. And I don't care really what the phraseology is, but I know that one of the big problems is this difficulty with terms like liberal and left,
Yeah.
which are very meaningful and clear to some people, but it also leads them to be unable to clearly distinguish themselves from ideologies and groups that are actually sabotaging the very efforts we're trying to make. So the meta perspective is not just to go beyond postmodernism, it's also to clarify what postmodernism is and really should be as a mobilization.
This is key. This brings me to a really important point, which, you know, again, we could just build a consensus building workshop just around this. And this is defining a set of key terms. And it's a function of abstraction, right? Like how much kind of resolution do we give to each concept, right? You know, you can start with a glossary, right? So we work with a kind of a glossary that's drawn from, you know, the authoritative sources, but then, you know, we tweak it, but you know, it has to have a few more layers of depth than a glossary. But at minimum, right, it's this new baseline that, because just as you said, precisely some of these very basic concepts, like basic distinctions between left and liberal, right? And what is postmodernism, right? Because people like to collapse it into a one-dimensional meaning, right? So we could build consensus just around definitions, right? And so this would be a very kind of, I want to say remedial, maybe that's not the right word, but like, you know, just a very entry level aspect of this, right? And it's not that people aren't brilliant, right? People have their own expertise, and you can have a PhD and still be dumb in some areas of life. But foregrounding a common set of terms so we can actually have a conversation, right? That's the prefigurative work of the proto-synthesis. So I wanted to hammer on that point because we often skip over definitions and we assume what we mean, you know, and other people assume what we mean, and that's a huge mistake, right? These are vicious abstractions, by definition, to use William James's term. So that's important to me too. You know, I've made some, for example, the Smart Cities book I worked on has a glossary. You know, it's basic, but that would be a starting point for some of this.
Yeah, that's good, and I'm glad you do that kind of work because I'm extremely cavalier about resources and reference material myself. You and I, we each authored a thing on the Teal New Deal.
Yeah.
I think it's very in line with what we've just been saying, because on the one hand, that's explicitly attempt to be meta progressive, right? But it's also an attempt to see what kind of sense making could be engaged in relative to some theme. If you take the principle of the Green New Deal, we ought to be able to get together from the meta postmodern community and say, which of these things can we get behind? Which of these things do we need to drop? Where do we have to tinker with it in order for us to be supporters of this thing that already has energy and traction in the world, but also sober custodians of what it ought to mean?
Yeah, the Teal New Deal is a good thing to bring in because, you know, it was kind of left hanging because we couldn't find many collaborators. But I think between us, we established some good starting points, right? And just to remind us what it was about, it was the state of integral theory, right? In the current state, and it in part follows on the schism going back to 2015 and beyond. There's been past bifurcations and conflicts, and as I wrote about integral and metamodernism last September, that was an important question for people because of Hansi's work. There was a lot of collapsing of the distinction between integral and metamodernism, right? And as I explained, they're not the same thing. there's a fair degree of overlap through Hansi's work, right? There's a lot. It's a clear path for integralists to kind of ratchet up their understanding, but it presents some challenges too. So readers will often downsample anything that they read, but that is a case in point, right? So we had all sorts of people, integralists, misunderstanding that, and it's a post-political move, right? But that doesn't mean people can still remain in their biased political stance, right? We have to recognize that we're all flawed in that sense, and we have incomplete information, and there's a lot of misinformation. So, Hansi's theories are prefigurative politics, but it lacks the framework for working through it, right? When you actually bring it to life. So what I was trying to introduce, and you as well, and also Joe Perez, who's used the term, was we all mean slightly different things, and that's fine. But coming back to this consensus building idea, if we actually converge and talk about it, then we get a more common understanding. And it's actually better than we could all create individually. So for me, the Teal New Deal was, a kind of pact to commit to a process between integralists who are stuck and metamodern thinkers and theory, and sort of, actually put into process working that out. And then it was also to, build consensus around meta progressivism politics, as you said. And in Joe Perez's sense, and mine as well, it was to build literacy around the Green New Deal itself, right? So even if you're not a Bernie supporter, or you think the Green New Deal is imperfect, there's really no alternative, right? So we're past there is no alternative stance about capitalism. Now we're moving into, well, there's no alternative, or as was it Indra Adnan who said there are many alternatives, or something like that. So we're moving into this phase where there's lots of alternatives, but there's really no alternative to not pursue renewable energy and universal healthcare, universal education, right? So these are things I want to build consensus around, and we already have a growing kind of implicit consensus. The democratic support for these things is there. So Teal New Deal, because so many integralists are centrists and or reactionaries, because they're reacting to the culture war over the value politics and the policy politics. So they become reactionaries. It's to build consensus and to level up, because they all like this teal color. And it's a New Deal, right? It packages it with the spirit of the New Deal, of a jobs guarantee, of better kind of, rights and welfare services. So, this is kind of coming full circle, and there's still work to be done, so again, we could have another cohort of integralists and metamodern thinkers, and we kind of hash out what a Teal New Deal consensus would be.
Yeah, I think that's essential. I mean, we each put forward some of our ideas, and they're pretty good sets of ideas, but it's insufficient just for individuals to have broad, balanced overviews of things that take a lot of factors into account. There's some kind of real dynamic bridge that has to be built between what integral and spiral dynamics would call the second tier and the late first tier, right? Or that the metamodern and postmodern alliance to try to deal with what modernity is. I'm not quite as hardline on the distinctions between integral and metamodern as you. That's probably because each of those groups I think of as a much broader group than the people who foreground the actual dogma and systems, right? To
Fair
me,
enough. Yeah.
integralists are a small subset of integral in my mind, right? So
Yeah. Gotcha.
I'm very loose with some of those definitions, but there absolutely is a need to clarify what those groups have in common and other groups of a similar level or insight set, and how they can work with really existing political progress of some kind, because there are a set of minimum system upgrades that we need that should not be considered radical, right? They're not just the left gone too far, right? It's really
Yeah.
nothing to do with the normal sense of the political spectrum. It's the basic things we need in order to have quality of life moving forward, and also security and resilience in the face of chaotic disruptions that are definitely coming. So that's essential, and it's urgent, and those changes have to be at the scale and tempo of the real problems. Some people are going to think that's radical, but I would actually say it's radical to not do that, to not do the minimum system upgrade that we need, and that we
Yeah.
could get people who are seemingly on the left and the right to both buy into that if they have the right frame of mind.
Yeah. And the byproduct of that, whether it's a conscious intention or not, but I think it's good to make all of these things conscious intentions. The byproduct is depolarization, right? So you can still be on the right or whatever, but you have to do better. You have to really, I mean, you know, right is sliding into neo-fascism, right? So it's a really tough place to be, because you want to deny it, you want to dig your heels in and defend it to some extent because you feel attacked, right? This increases polarization. What we want to do is depolarize. And as I said earlier at some point, like, the process of letting go is part of this. You need to shelve some of your preconceptions and biases and commitments, at least for the process, right? At least provisionally. Um, and there are, because it's about depolarization and demystification. You can build more broad-based support for something like healthcare for all, right? Medicare for all. And again, with the politicization, right? If the question is phrased correctly, you'd have 100% support, right? Because who in their right mind would deny free medical services if you get hit by a car, you slip on ice and fracture your elbow? Like, we gotta, it's just, I can't even, I get too heated. I can't even get into debates about healthcare because it's just so dumb. People are missing the basic pieces of the puzzle. um So, and yeah, there's all sorts of things to try to build agreement and consensus about. But part of where my critique comes in is to reveal where a lot of these communities, whether they're personal development or sense making, they've already gone through phases where they've gone pathological and they've said things that aren't true and they've engaged in abusive behavior, right? So there needs to be a kind of reckoning and, metanoia in these communities. And fundamentally it's a choice, right? And ending war is a choice. Like, having truth and reconciliation commissions is a choice.
There's definitely an element of choice to it. We have the
Yeah.
opportunity to do these things, but we need, there's emotional preconditions, there's energy preconditions, there's
Yeah.
incentive structure preconditions. So we need to make it such that a choice of that kind could be enacted.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, on the face of it, this whole consensus building project might seem like a waste of time to people, because they might already be getting kind of positive reinforcement from what they're doing, right? Like, why would I change? I'm getting lots of donations. um, and that's where a lot of the reactionary ideology comes from, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, those existing reinforcement structures are a tricky one, right? Obviously, a lot of it's financial, but there's also a lot of it that's emotional, right? It's very easy now, I think, to critique a sort of mainstream pseudo-left position where people congratulate themselves on token signaling of support for identity issues while continuing to participate in the very economic structure conditions that create those problems in the first place.
Yeah.
And congratulating themselves, getting a dopamine hit, you know?
Yeah.
I'm like that too, you know what I mean? Like, I'm a white guy, and if I get along well with a couple East Indian guys on the street, suddenly I'm congratulating myself, you know?
Yeah. 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 And we're seeing a lot of that kind of like co-optation and, you know, I want to call it blackwashing, right? Because there's greenwashing and pinkwashing. And now we see all these corporations being like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter. But, you know, they're not backing it up by the same kind of deep fundamental changes and policy alignments that other people, progressives, Black people have been advocating for a long time, right? And then they say like, Andrew Cuomo comes to mind because he's the governor of, or is he the mayor or governor of New York, you know, and he's like, okay, yeah, let's have that conversation. You know, I'm ready to listen. And it's like, where the fuck have you been while all this is happening? And you know, there's a certain incredulity to his, and Nancy Pelosi's the same way. Like they just give lip service to these things. You know, they give platitudes, but truly the kind of progressive edge is already ahead of the curve with these things. We know what needs to be done. But then also that message gets diluted and perverted because it's not properly heard and integrated, right? So they too lack the consensus building potential. And so, coming back to what this is about in the meta sense, right? If these communities like Emerge and Game B and whatever are an integral, are genuinely trying to like figure out the praxis and the practices for collective sense making, and especially trying to prepare themselves for a moment when they are the trusted people to seek, we need to do a hell of a lot better. And also, if we're trying to build practices that scale up, you know, we need to practice it. We need to do it. So even without any pressure for building a particular consensus, we need to experiment with the process. And as the research suggests, for the process to work, we need to commit to it. You can't do it half-assed. You can't underfund it. You know, it needs to be like really pursued vigorously, you know. And the good news is, right, as we've kind of suggested throughout, that it lightens the load for the individual. So we're all not carrying the world on our shoulders, but that we can actually trust a collective sense-making project, right? And, you know, as I've established at this point, right, outlets like Rebel Wisdom, like, don't talk to leftists. They don't talk to sociologists. They're not inclusive of that discourse. What they do is they criticize it, and they invite centrists and moderates and reactionaries to discuss what they think. But that's not conducive to trust or truth, you know. So we're getting further away from where we need to be, going down those roads. And and so it's in their interest, it's in all of our interest to have an open conversation about these types of things. And coming back to racism, right? So in Game B, there was lots of miscommunication, lots of suppression of concepts, right? There was lots of projection of motives and all these sorts of things. There's a lot of paranoia, right? So the very structure of that conversation was conducive to failure. And what I'm proposing, you know, if we're to workshop and build consensus around racism, there's a lot of aspects to that, right? Part of it is just, again, the kind of shared resources, the conceptual foundation, the lexicon of terms, what things mean, right? And how can we demystify and, you know, defang a concept like white fragility so people can actually work with it, right? And for example, you know, that is a concept that I as a leftist can critique too, because it's not perfect. It's a very kind of watered down liberal kind of like personal journey for that author, and that's going to be useful to some people, but then that theory and that label will also be offensive to lots of people, and so it backfires. And so we need to again use these the tools of the emotional dojo and the tools of the mimetic mediators and whoever else, and create a space where these concepts can be people can be kind of desensitized to it in a positive, constructive sense. And then the concepts can be foregrounded in a kind of non-polarizing sense. So we can collectively understand things like the protests, right? And again, it's already happening implicitly as people take initiative on their own to learn about these things, like Juneteenth, which was yesterday, right? It's like, okay, here's an opportunity, and the public discourse is shifting, and anti-racist books are climbing the bestseller lists. So it's starting to happen, but it's still a kind of tenuous process, and it still requires, at least for our purposes and for the for the long game and the ability to scale up these practices, I think it demands that we start workshopping these sort of convergence and consensus building projects.
I think so too. I think we need a lot more concision, clarity, and convergence around, like you say, both terminology and policy proposals. Because on the one hand, like with terminology, for example, we have to be clear enough that we could state the point of a concept in different words.
Yeah.
And also we need to be able to short circuit the tendency of any given terminology to slide into its opposite, so to speak. Like you're saying white fragility. I mean, another thing is like the Black Lives Matter slogan. It's very meaningful to a lot of people, but by the very way that the phrase is structured, it seems to beg an additional statement, right? It makes people immediately go, yeah, but what about all lives? Or what about cop lives, right?
Right, blue lives matter.
The energy slides out of the conceptual container and starts to mutate. And that's fine, right? And we don't have to police every phrasing, but we do have to be able to see for ourselves and share amongst ourselves the reason why the energy is in that container and what that means, how else it could be said, but essentially what's going on there. We don't want the energy to constantly escape from each term by virtue of any little hole or ambiguity in the phrasing.
Yeah, perfect. And to pivot to something we haven't talked about, like socialism is one of these words that also kind of fosters the same divergence in people. And so that as it's an umbrella term, just like capitalism and democracy and liberalism and Marxism. Like, these are very big containers, but I'd want to foreground socialism because there's so much confusion around that term. Like, who is a socialist? What is a socialist? What historical period are we talking about? What country are we talking about? And there's different basic definitions, and those basic definitions can conflict, right? Like, I take a more philosophical definition than a more economic one. Like, the philosophy is grounded in economics, but when I say this, it means like the economic definition is typically like, oh, the workers own the means of production. And that's a pretty, 18th, 19th century terminology and abstraction. And, we need to unpack it. But the philosophical definition is that, well, back up a second, we're going to get to the economic fairness part, but philosophically, socialism is rooted in the social, right? And so, and then we can go off into tangents like, Nazis, which have socialism in the word, like, it wasn't socialism, right? And this isn't a cop-out, like, that wasn't real socialism. Like, it wasn't socialism. Like, certain aspects were socialized, right, so they could be a kind of hegemonic force, but it wasn't in any way a principled socialism because it excluded groups of people. It wasn't universal. And so that's key, bringing it back today, and many of the people who had to flee Nazi Germany, like Albert Einstein, were socialists, right? in 1949, Albert Einstein wrote, "Why Socialism?" Right? So this is what we need to bring back in, and Martin Luther King. So these people's message isn't distorted. And so we build up a positive socialism, that we're clear on what that means, at least for the purposes of consensus building, right? We depolarize and, turn down the temperature of the room. And so people can go, oh yeah, I get it. And it's not like a groupthink or a pressure thing, but it's like, okay, I understand something now that I didn't understand before. And that, it doesn't mean you have to go back out and wield that label, but it's important to understand what it means, why it's become so contentious in the United States, why it's always been contentious in the United States, right? Why politics has been divorced from the labor movement. There's a lot to unpack here that people choose not to explore together. They choose to retreat into their camps, or they choose to avoid these terms because they know they're problematic, right? But yeah, we have to take them seriously.
Yeah, socialism would be an interesting one to do a convergence process on, for sure, right? And it would, like you've been saying, it would demand a certain literacy in a standard set of varieties of definitions of socialism as a background, and on the basis of that, people could say to each other, here's what I usually mean when I say that word, because I know very much, like, I have a fairly positive connotation with it, but absolutely there's all kinds of negative realities that have been associated with that word. So it's very difficult to remember always to say, rather than just float the term and assume it's in play and agreed upon, to say, to describe the thing that you mean by that term. And then those descriptions can relate to each other, and we can decide at the end that it's a good term to go with, or maybe it's a bad term to go with. But as long as we've got consensus on the meanings that were underlying those things. And I see again the difference between the surface and the depth level, which is separated by whether or not we accept contradictions between each. We say, oh, this word actually means something different to different people, or it means something different to me than I think it does, or I imagine I have this ideal and I'm really not acting on that. There's a whole layer of acceptance of self-contradiction that has to be opened up to get us from surface consensus to real consensus.
Yeah. And what also pops into my head is that, the classroom model of, here's a teacher, here's a curriculum, here's a bunch of content, here's some assignments, and I'm going to grade those assignments, and you're going to be tested at the end. Let's say it's a socialism class, right? Like I do still believe in that model of education. However, obviously that's not what I'm proposing, right? I'm proposing a kind of, whether it's low level with novices or kind of high level with like graduate seminar type thing, I'm inviting the consensus building project, right? Which is different. There's no test. There's no test at the end. What you get at the end is a consensus, ideally. And so there's still going to be that kind of homework, so to speak, but it's a completely different format, and it has a different, purpose. And again, going back to the beginning, like we are called to it. I especially am called to this project because my intellectual foundations are very interdisciplinary. That requires me to sort of map a provisional consensus across all those fields and thinkers. And, within my own process, and I hope in everybody's process, there's a kind of self-auditing and a self-criticism, so you don't get too overconfident in any one particular position. And that you're reflexive. You continually evaluate and upgrade and redefine these things. And, there's, let's say I am an authority on some of these things. I'm incentivized. There's a benefit for me to pursue this process so that I learn, so that it's not spreading my consensus, but that I learn from the other people and I strengthen, or transform my own understanding, or at least the way I talk about it.
I think that's essential, because there are a lot of personal rewards.
Yeah.
Right? There's the increase of clarity, which comes with a sense of empowerment. There's a real spiritual kind of enjoyment that comes from realizing that you have clarity and communion with some kind of political situation in the world that isn't forced and isn't dogmatic. It's just happening and you resonate with it.
Yeah.
That's a very beautiful feeling, as well as the sense of growth that comes from working problems out and working with contradictions. The whole growth mindset concept suggests to us that the real benefit, the real self-esteem feeling, comes from working on things you aren't good at yet and haven't just been rewarded for. So when you see those, that should feel like opportunity, right? When you see disagreement, when you see mysterious political blockage, when you think, oh my God, do I really have to, hash my differences out with Brent, right? And you don't have to, but it should feel like a positive opportunity, right? We
Yeah.
should get the taste of why that goes to a good feeling in ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that's all great. I want to pivot to something more fringy, like
Right?
which is conspiracy theory, right? Conspiracy theorists feel very alienated, right? Feel very manipulated and misinformed, which makes sense. And they're searching for consensus, right? They're actually searching for a different type of consensus. They're searching for a fringe consensus, and you can find it on the fringes, right? There is so-called experts in all these little spin-off conspiracy theories. But let's take something really basic like flat earthers, or reptilians or QAnon or whatever. Those people should want to be, I think they should feel incentivized to want to find a more down-to-earth consensus, even one that results in some uncertainty, right? But that structure doesn't exist, right? Conspiracy theory is very polarizing. It doesn't, like they might not have access to education, or they might be skeptical of it for right or wrong reasons. But there are experts. I write about conspiracy. There's a lot to just foreground, basic misunderstandings about things. And then the point I want to get to, though, is like with some kind of high profile cases, we can try to build consensus around it, but that doesn't mean we're going to come up with a definitive answer, right? So in this case, that's kind of a good thing. It might lead to inaction rather than action. Right? With climate change, we want it to lead to action. But with conspiracy theory, if it's true, maybe it does lead to action. If there's uncertainty, maybe it leads to inaction, right? Because what we don't want is people going out and acting in the world, right? Like mass shooters acting on the cultural Marxism conspiracy. That's happened, right? And so that's bad. That's wrong. We want to build consensus around these controversial topics as well, even if that consensus is uncertain, right? So if it comes to things like like 9/11, which are very complex events, we're not going to reach a definitive conclusion, but we can start to build consensus about some basic facts, like maybe XYZ point has actually been debunked. XYZ theory has been debunked, but maybe there's other things that are more down to earth that are often glossed over. Like we knew from the beginning the hijackers were Saudi mostly, but then information is revealed later that there was like Saudi officials involved, right? And so there's a little cloak and dagger kind of stuff. And we know there's a cover up, right? So we can agree that there's a cover up and maybe not necessarily a conscious conspiracy. There's all these sorts of little distinctions that can be
lots
made.
Of levels at which we could get agreement.
Yeah.
And I think, like I was saying earlier, particularly agreement about how we should act, even if there's uncertainty about what the fact is. Because as much as we absolutely need to prune out some obvious errors from our sense-making process before we get started, we also live in a world where there is a lot of ambiguity, and things can turn out to be not at all what they factually appeared to be. So we need to keep that in mind. But I think we can work with that to come to, what do we need to do about 9/11? What do we need to do about aliens? It's probably easier to get a consensus on what we would do under which conditions than about what the fact is. And I know a lot of people who are have a legitimate philosophical interest in conspiracy theory. And most people we call conspiracy theorists there's not much theory there, right?
Yeah.
They're not really doing any analytic work. It's a strange universe. We know for a fact a lot of things that feel absolutely abnormal really did happen in the historical record. We also know that our notion of reality might be very insufficient, and there might be a large class of events in which the hyper peculiar comes forward, and that's worth having a look at. However, a lot of people who we dismiss as conspiracy theorists are premature critical thinkers, and they're turning to rising mythologies because the system isn't operating at a level of coherence that gives them any satisfaction at the level of global sense making. But they're also looking at gaps and holes and problems and how systems function in a very primitive, cartoonish, and emotional way because they haven't had the kind of education or encouragement they need in order to get more nuanced about the real sources of these phenomena. So there's a lot of potential to bring in the conspiracy spirit, right, and move it into a real critique. But at the same time, we have to, police the obvious errors that people might not realize are errors.
Yeah, I want to pivot from 9/11 directly to the Iraq War, because that was a case where they built up a fake consensus, right? The fake consensus was already predetermined in 1999 in the Project for a New American Century. So the neocon consensus, right? But after 9/11, it built up this kind of political will that shouldn't ever have existed. But there was a kind of path dependence and momentum and peer pressure and financial incentives, right? So it happened. So there was a majority enough to start the war, right, and carry it out. But there was, when it comes back to this action under uncertainty, there was lots of dissenters and critics of the Iraq War who also didn't have complete information and also could completely decouple it from the question of what happened on 9/11. Because obviously Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 directly, at least. But the pitch for the Iraq War itself wasn't sufficient enough for people like Bernie Sanders, right? So they objected on those grounds, right? And they had reason to believe, of course, that the evidence to weapons of mass destruction was trumped up and didn't exist. So it's such a great example because we have to be historically revisionist and look at who was right, who had the true consensus beforehand, and how they got it and how it was blocked, right? Because nobody, the majority didn't want to talk about the anti-war consensus, right? And there is a kind of kind of provisional anti-war consensus that is bad, and in retrospect it's correct. So this is another kind of consensus, right, under uncertainty, again with 9/11, and one of the most prominent skeptics is the historian Howard Zinn, right? And he never gave a concrete statement of what he thought happened. He would just say things like that, I disbelieve the official version, and so that's I think that's probably one of the most consistent and accurate positions to take, given the mystification and politicization of these issues. So this is another consensus I want to build today, which, or not today, but over this time, is the anti-war consensus, right? So we unpack the concepts and the principles that actually demonstrate that war is usually not necessary or not the most effective solution in terms of everybody winning. It's usually a strategic decision to exercise and expand power. Yeah.
That's a tricky one. It definitely deserves, a whole session of its own. And it's similar to policing in a way, right?
Yeah.
There is absolutely a legitimate role for it under certain conditions, but in so many cases, it's used in ways that in hindsight are egregious because it's an extension of a power system, right? So when we say anti-war, really what we mean are fewer bad wars and more good wars. But what does that really mean, right? How many actually could be useful and good? Under what conditions is it legitimate? And those conditions have to be a much smaller percentage of the kinds of reasons we've gone to war typically.
Yeah.
And how do you set up a war machine that is far less likely to engage in the wrong kind of activity? Just like how do you set up a police department, even if you partially defund it and spread that funding around to other forms of community services, which is a great idea. But even with the block you have left, how do you make sure that it doesn't continually sway into either tribal gang pathologies or unthinking service to potentially pathological status quo interests? Those are really important questions, and that's one where a lot of people will have different feelings of charge.
Yeah.
It would need a whole process on its own.
But I would foreground a kind of basic principle that we can't get around, which is that as I've written in my work, right, picking up on other people's work, we need to build a peace industrial complex, right? It's a different thing. So you phrased it like, how do we have a war machine that does better, right? But that's the wrong framing, right? We need a peace industrial complex, and we need to dismantle the military industrial complex. And as I said to Vinay yesterday, in terms of, the time horizon of all this, there are diminishing returns to war. Right? Like even if I concede that historically it was inevitable, it made sense in game theoretical terms, that's increasingly not true anymore, right? There's diminishing returns. And so we're the returns are going to diminish to zero. Where we need to invert the process and build up peace. And that's why, look, it's 2020. I don't want to delay the start of this consensus building any longer. I don't want to start in 2021. I don't want it to start in 2022 or 2025. And there's a lot of cynics and skeptics and realists who think, okay, we're not there yet. We're things are going to continue to get worse. And Hansi thinks things are going to get worse. Michelle Bowens thinks things are going to get worse.
Everybody thinks
things are going to get worse.
Certainly in the United States, but
and perhaps they are. But we have to recognize the privileged bubble that we live in. Yeah. That things might not be getting worse for us. And maybe it will start to creep in and affect some of us, but by and large, this is about how it's going to disaffect the poor, the disenfranchised, etc., all over the world. So
right now we have the opportunity to take action, right?
Yeah, we have a pandemic.
Wait for it to get worse, you're going to get more motivation, but you're also going to get more stress and incapacity.
Exactly.
People who are in a privileged spot at the edge of crisis, those are the people who have to leverage that privilege in order to try to figure out how to mobilize against these things before they get worse.
Exactly. We can't waste this opportunity. And it's an opportunity of the moment in many ways. The lockdown is keeping a lot of us available and out of work. And, this is American spring happening right now, and we're transitioning into the summer, right? The solstice is like tomorrow, right? So, it's the summer of love. That's, normatively what it should be. But we really have to work at it. It's not just going to happen. It's not just going to emerge. We need to embody and demonstrate that love through a consensus building project.
Yeah. And
so I invite.
That involves bringing a lot of different things together.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of different sides, a lot of perspectives, a lot of different feelings, even a lot of different scales. Like when we're talking about the military, that's kind of a scale issue. Like if you pull back, absolutely a peace industrial complex. But then if you zoom in, you're like, well, what does what does military look like under those conditions, right? How is it effectively mobilizing in
Yeah.
non-destructive areas against, say, climate change?
A
But that's
lot.
a zoom
Yeah.
in, and then you pull
Yeah.
out. So a lot of problems people have one of the things the convergence process has to address
Yeah.
is that people are very often disagreeing about what scale they're discussing
Yeah.
rather than what we should actually do.
Here's
So
how it's
getting,
going to work in a
yeah,
nutshell, to just to give those people something to do. Right. So the new peace industrial complex, right? Because we got to have a transition, right? Not just dismantling and building up another thing, but transitioning. So, a lot more meditation and kung fu and negotiation and conflict resolution skills, and a lot less guns and jets and bombs and, sitting behind a computer screen and scheming, or steering the drone, or watching the drone, just pushing the button and giving the order. Right. So we have a big set of things that need to be scaled up and a big set of things that need to be scaled down. Right. And this is where the convergence process comes into play too, because all these things are coming together. All the technology is coming together. And do we want the technology to culminate in a big bomb that can blow the planet up, or a surveillance apparatus? No, fuck that.
so before we get too far down that road, because I think we've got to wrap up in a few minutes, I've
Yeah.
got my own ideas about how to skew the military industrial complex in a
Big
good direction.
topic.
Yeah, big topic, a lot of energy, and for us, and probably for a lot of people. So how do we end this session? Like, what do we want to leave people with? Are we at the point where we want to give obviously we might have some people in mind who we really want to foreground in terms of starting convergence processes. We also want to see who would like to be involved, who kind of gets it, when they could be involved, that kind of stuff. We want to start shifting from us working on it, because like you say, it's urgent, into actually doing one. So what are those steps?
Yeah, the steps can be, because everyone's got different schedules and priorities. So, the convergence begins with just whatever people can do, whatever people can muster, right? So one-to-one conversations are always essential and productive. We've had lots of them, and we implicitly build, a bond and some more common ideas and, collective action. So, I'm waiting on some other people to get back to me about when a first group session can be, so there's that. But in the meantime, right, there's no time to waste. People should be researching the right things. They should be looking into this article and my sources. They should be reaching out to either of us. I hope we can build out a consensus in the integral left group that we're in. And, I'm going to try to keep injecting this into other spaces that I'm in. So, there's an uncertainty on my part too. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have control over it. But I've done the best I can, and you've helped there. And I think you're doing the best you can for us to unpack what consensus building is about, what it could look like. And, I don't know what else to say. I'll give you the last word.
Well, this is, in my view, absolutely the kind of thing that needs to happen now. And so I'm throwing my support behind any version of it I can see anybody working on. And I'm committed to participation, right? If you can set up 8 sessions, I'm in. I'll be there. Layman Pascal is on board with this kind of project.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time today, Layman. And that concludes our session for today. And we'll catch you all next time. Oh, hold on a second here.